The small nation of Belgium has been the victim of invasion and occupation by Germany twice in the past 110 years. In 1914, the forces of Kaiser Wilhelm II overran Belgium, and the atrocities which followed made headline news throughout the world. The German occupation of neutral Belgium enraged the Western allies of Britain and France, and the atrocities that occurred there, as well as some that did not, were used by the Allies to recruit soldiers and to raise money for the war effort. In 1940, the Germans under Hitler invaded and occupied Belgium once again. It should come as no surprise that the Nazis perpetrated hundreds of atrocities in Belgium during the war, including the elimination of many Belgian Jews in the camps of the Holocaust. There is no doubt that Belgium was the victim of horrific acts during the Germans' two occupations, but many people do not know that Belgium itself carried out crimes against humanity in its occupation of today's Congo in Southwest Africa. Many historians and sociologists classify what happened in Belgium as a genocide, and lay much of the blame for it at the feet of one man, Belgian King Leopold II, who reigned as King of Belgium from 1865 to 1909, and as the ruler of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908. Over the last few years, many Belgians, including many of African descent, have brought much of what happened in the Congo to light in their country. But outside Belgium, there are many people who do not know what happened there in the late 1800s. The official title of the Belgian kings is King of the Belgians. In Belgium, there is a difference between the titles King of Belgium and the King of the Belgians. The first suggests that the monarch is the owner of all of the country's land. The second title implies that he simply reigns over the Belgians in the constitutional monarchy that's existed in the country since it separated from Holland and the United Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1830. The Belgian king, and it's been a king, not a queen since independence, was never an absolute monarch, though in the 19th century the king had considerable more power and influence than King Philippe does today. The problem for Leopold was that he really wanted to be that king. You know, the "your wish is my command, sire" type king. And he could not be that kind of a king to the Belgians, who had gone through much debate, internal strife, and some bloodshed to prevent that kind of absolute monarchy in Belgium. Much of Western Europe was going through the second age of imperialism in the latter part of the 19th century. Great Britain's empire spanned the globe, the largest empire the world has ever seen. The French controlled a great deal of Africa and parts of the Middle East. Italy had a small African empire. Holland had extensive colonies in the Pacific, most notably today's Indonesia. Even declining Spain and Portugal had colonies in Africa and the Far East in the late 1800s. Some in Belgium called Leopold II the Great Builder, for in Belgium he sponsored and promoted the building of new roads, public buildings, and a variety of public works, many of which are still in existence. Many in the country believed that was his purpose in attempting to gain the Congo River area for Belgium, to improve and modernize the vast forested territory. He also wanted to spread the Christian faith and to bring Western culture and technology to the area. There were some major problems with Leopold's plan. First, many Belgians did not want to enter the race for empire, as some people called the late 1800s. They knew that even if colonies did strengthen their country in some way, and they usually didn't, except in the case of Britain, having more territory, especially on a continent being fought over by the major powers of Britain, France, and later Germany, would increase the chances of war. A war which the Belgians knew they could not win. What's more, colonies cost money, and very few ever showed a profit for the mother country. Quite the opposite, actually. They were money pits, and the Belgian government, which Leopold was but the ceremonial head of, refused to authorize Leopold's plan. So he found a workaround. In 1869, Henry Morgan Stanley, a British journalist and explorer, went in search of another missing Englishman, Dr. David Livingstone, who had gone missing somewhere in Central Africa during his search for the source of the Nile River. 2 years later, Stanley found Livingstone near Lake Tanganyika in modern Tanzania, surrounded by what Stanley believed were hostile tribesmen. With a British sense of irony and understatement, Stanley approached Livingstone, the only other white person present, and uttered what became incredibly famous words throughout the Western world. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Stanley and Livingstone became famous figures throughout the world, and Stanley in particular saw the potential in the land he had passed through to find the good doctor, whose purpose was to find a way to end the still thriving African slave trade, most of those enslaved people being sent to the Middle East or to rival tribes within Africa. Stanley's exploits brought him to the attention of Leopold, and the king hired the Welshman as his own personal agent in the Congo River basin. Now, it may strike us as odd today, but King Leopold, with the tacit agreement of the Belgian government and the approval of the Western European nations at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, simply claimed much of today's Congo as his. It's that simple. He sent mercenaries to enforce his rule, and the territory became known as the Congo Free State. What's more, the Belgian government loaned the king much of the money he would need in his attempt to control and improve the area, despite their fears of losing their investment, which they eventually did. Since Leopold was the owner of the Congo Free State, he was able to control it as the absolute ruler. Congo was essentially Leopold's cash cow. The easiest and most profitable item to be found in Congo at the time was ivory, but as you might guess, it only took a short time for most of the elephants in Congo to be killed off. Not only that, but in the late 1800s, a new natural resource, rubber, competed with oil for profitability. Leopold ordered that Congo be turned into as large a rubber plantation as possible, and that's what happened. Congo is 79 times the size of Belgium, and it all belonged to Leopold. Slavery was illegal in Belgium. It was not illegal in the Congo. Whatever Leopold said was legal was legal. Perhaps more exactly, it seems that Leopold did not care what was done in Congo and to the many different tribes of the Congo, as long as he got paid from the trade in rubber and other natural resources. Let's be honest, the Western European nations and the United States were incredibly racist at the time. Though all of these countries had done away with actual slavery, the treatment of non-white minorities, especially of black people, was horrible. This was especially the case in the African colonies, and though the treatment of black Africans in English and French territories can be described as less severe than that of Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, the native people were treated as second or third-class people in their own countries. We don't use the words second-class citizens because the people of colonial Africa were not citizens. They were ruled by outsiders from above. The attitude of Leopold and the people who worked for him in the Congo was particularly horrific. It ranged from disinterest to outright cruelty. It also needs to be said that many of the men working as mercenaries for Leopold in Congo were black Africans as well, usually men from tribes hostile to many of those working on the rubber plantations and elsewhere. Towards the end of Leopold's reign in Congo, there were approximately 120 European officers and sergeants commanding nearly 4,000 African soldiers in what was called the Force Publique. Among those people was the Zapo-Zap tribe, their real name. The Zapo-Zaps were a warrior culture from eastern Congo and had instilled fear throughout the region for some time. One of the most frightening things about the Zapo-Zaps, in addition to their proclivity to slaughter groups of innocent villagers on rubber plantations, was the fact that they sharpened their teeth. Yes, many of the men had teeth that looked like a nightmare picture from some horrible movie about vampires or cannibals. And yes, the Zapo-Zaps were cannibals. They practiced cannibalism especially at ceremonies, but also after their raids. Brains, eyeballs, and most of the rest of the human body was considered a delicacy. They fried human flesh much like people fry bacon. And these were some of the men that made up the Force Publique. The Zapo-Zaps were not prevented from the practice by their officers, provided they did not see it. It was one of the many ways that Leopold maintained control over the population. What was going on in Congo eventually became public knowledge. Belgian officers and NCOs returning home, missionaries, journalists, and others openly discussed what they had seen. Eventually, photographs of what was going on in the Congo reached England, France, the USA, and Belgium. Many people were outraged by what they saw in the photos, which included not only smiling Zapo-Zaps, but evidence of other atrocities. Perhaps the last image of the slaughter that took place in the Congo region came in the form of amputated hands, arms, legs, and feet. In order to get paid and to save money on bullets, the men of the Force Publique cut off the hands, etc. of those they punished for not producing their required quota of rubber and other resources. Literal mountains of hands were photographed by journalists and published throughout the Western world. One of the most infamous pictures from the time is of a man who escaped Congo with the hand and foot of his young daughter. The rest of her had been eaten by the Zapo-Zaps. It's estimated that anywhere between 1 and 10 million people died or were killed as a result of Leopold's occupation of the Congo. Latest estimates point towards the higher figure. Many hundreds of thousands were beaten, whipped, and otherwise abused. Infection from wounds caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, perhaps more. Additionally, the people on the rubber plantations were forbidden to leave, and the food coming into the plantations was minimal, substandard, and often not delivered. Millions died from starvation or the diseases which ravaged a malnourished body. What's more, the crowding of so many people on plantations caused the many endemic and deadly diseases of the area to spread like wildfire. Millions more died from disease during the time of Leopold's rule. Finally, reports and testimony from people that had escaped the plantations and the many missionaries and journalists in the area who were working to bring the situation in Congo to the world's attention reached the eyes and ears of those in power in England, France, and the USA. Large protests in Western capitals also brought the situation, which was described as a crime against humanity by Black American military hero, historian, and minister George Washington Williams, home to millions in the Western world. Incidentally, the phrase crime against humanity developed for the first time because of the horrible conditions in Congo, which has since rightly been named a genocide by most historians. The pressure on Belgium to do something about the situation mounted to the point where they relieved Leopold of his property, but not without paying him 50 million francs for it, as well as hundreds of millions more to investors. In the end, Belgium took control of the Congo Free State itself, and the region became known as the Belgian Congo until it became independent in 1960. Belgian rule, as opposed to Leopold's personal rule, was relatively mild. Relatively being the key word, because anything less harsh than genocide is still pretty brutal. Leopold II never went to the Congo. Some people trying to protect the reputation of Belgium and of its king state that Leopold did not know what was going on in Congo. Leopold read newspapers. He also had many aides tell him what was happening there. What's more, upon giving up his rights there, Leopold ordered the destruction of the entire archive of documents pertaining to his time as owner of the Congo region. You don't have to be a genius to know why. The Caucasus Mountains and the region in which they lie are sort of a bridge between Europe and Asia, and lies between Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Within the region live Armenians, Georgians, North and South Ossetians, Cherkashians, Azerbaijanis or Azeris, Chechens, Dagestanis, Kurds, and many other different ethnic and tribal groups. These groups have had a tough time living near one another throughout history. War, clan feuds, and ethnic cleansing have taken place many times throughout history. One of the longest times of relative peace was when the Soviet Union, or USSR, dominated the entire region and kept the people of the Caucasus away from each other's throats through fear and force. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, many of the old ethnic and religious hatreds boiled over once again, especially between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In the fall of 2023, with the world already on edge because of the fighting in Ukraine and the Gaza Strip, the government of Azerbaijan, which has been spending increasing amounts of money on modern weapons in the last few years, moved into the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, one of the most peculiarly and dangerously located places in the world. The armed forces of Azerbaijan, following the order of its leader President Ilham Aliyev, moved into the region and ordered most people in it to leave. No one was sure what would happen if they stayed, but most people did not wait to find out. An estimated 100,000 people grabbed what belongings they could carry and fled. These people were Armenian, and Armenians had been living in Nagorno-Karabakh for centuries. But the story is not as clear-cut as it might seem. Welcome to a day in history. Today, the tragic story of Nagorno-Karabakh. Even today, Joseph Stalin is making people miserable. 100 years ago, he was the People's Commissar for Nationalities in the Soviet Union, just one of the many positions he held on his way to the top of the Soviet hierarchy. Stalin did not have an easy job because the new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was a group of smaller ethnic, cultural, and religious groups. Often, these groups were bitter historical enemies. Two were the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic and the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. Despite what most people think, Stalin would listen to the opinion of others, especially in the early years of the USSR, and he listened to leaders from both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Then he made his decision, and that was that. Even that early in his career, no one was going against Stalin, at least not anyone from regions that could fit inside Russia thousands of times over. Azerbaijan and Armenia sit side by side towards the southern end of the Caucasus. The Armenians are among the oldest Christian groups in the world. Christianity had been spreading in Armenia since the 1st century AD, and in 301 AD, King Tiridates III declared Christianity the official state religion, the very first Christian kingdom on earth. The Azerbaijanis are Muslim. From 700 through the early 1300s, Islam gradually became the dominant religion in Azerbaijan. Within what became the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic is the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, which measures about 50 miles from north to south and 30 from east to west. Before 2020, when the Armenians found themselves on the losing end of yet another war against the Azerbaijanis, between 85 to 90% of the people in the region were Armenians. The rest of the population were mainly Azeris, living in the territories north and east. About 1 to 3% of the population were Russians, Kurds, and ethnic Greeks. This is where Nagorno-Karabakh is located. As you can see, Nagorno-Karabakh lies totally inside the borders of Azerbaijan. Another region, Nakhchivan, lies on the far western side of Armenia. It's part of Azerbaijan, but is separated from the rest of the country by Armenia. It's likely to be a trouble spot soon as well. When Stalin gave Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan, he created heated resentments in Armenia that simmered for 7 decades. Armenians had lived in the region since before anyone could remember, and it was always regarded as Armenian. But by 1923, most of the surrounding area, including that between Armenia and the enclave, was Azerbaijani, and had been for centuries. Maybe Stalin thought he was doing the right thing. Perhaps he figured that the Soviet Union would last forever. He was wrong. In 1988, as the Soviet Union began to unravel, tension simmered beneath the surface, punctuated by whispers of self-determination that grew louder with the Soviet Union's waning breath. In 1988, the simmering pot boiled over. Karabakh Armenians demanded unification with Armenia, igniting a war that raged for 6 bloody years. Villages became battlegrounds, families were torn apart, and the region became a no-man's land of shattered homes and fractured communities. Both sides committed atrocities. Prisoners were tortured and executed, women and girls were assaulted, and villages were destroyed. Russia has almost always been an ally of sorts to Armenia. They are both Christian and, for centuries, and generally share an anti-Muslim outlook. The Azeris looked to the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey as an ally. In the 1990s, Russia, in particular, was concerned that Iran and Turkey, both Muslim countries, would extend their influence into the Caucasus region, which sits upon some of the richest oil fields in the world. So they sent weapons and troops to help the Azerbaijanis. On February 26, 1994, Armenian forces, along with elements of the Russian 366th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment, advanced into the Azeri village of Khojaly, in the western part of Nagorno-Karabakh. There, they ran amok. Estimates of the civilians tortured, mutilated, and killed by the Armenians and Russians run from 500 to 1,000. By 1994, a fragile ceasefire emerged, with Armenia and the self-proclaimed Republic of Artsakh holding Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 surrounding Azerbaijani districts. The war continued on and off until 1994, when a tenuous peace settlement was agreed upon. For over 2 decades, a precarious peace held sway. Scars healed, children played amid ruined walls, and hope tentatively bloomed. Yet, beneath the surface, the embers of conflict smoldered. Azerbaijan, fueled by oil wealth and nationalist fervor, never relinquished its claim on lost territory. Skirmishes fled intermittently, casting ominous shadows across the fragile truce. In 2020, the flames erupted once more. A full-scale war ignited, unleashing drones and artillery upon Karabakh's ancient churches and war-weary towns. This time, however, the tide turned. With Turkish backing, Azerbaijan made swift territorial gains, reclaiming much of what it had lost. A ceasefire brokered by Russia silenced the guns, but the human cost was staggering. Thousands lay dead, cities lay in ruins, and a new diaspora of Armenian refugees poured into their ancestral homeland, Armenia. When yet another peace was brokered, about 85% of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh had fled to Armenia or overseas. Most of those who remained lived in the regional capital, Stepanakert, Khakendi in Azeri. The remaining majority Armenian territory was called the Republic of Artsakh and was only connected to Armenia by a narrow strip of land kept open by the Russian military. From 2020 to 2023, the Azeris continued an unprecedented military buildup, and the language they used to describe what they were going to do to the remaining Armenian population when they had a chance alarmed the world. In the days leading up to the Azerbaijani offensive, which began in late September 2023, the Azerbaijani political and military leadership sought to calm world opinion, which had become increasingly concerned that a violent ethnic cleansing operation was about to take place. Knowing that it was likely that foreign interference might halt their plans should widespread ethnic violence occur, President Aliyev called his invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh a reintegration of the territory into his country. Knowing the history of the two people and that language often masks intentions, many Armenians began to flee. Those who were caught in Stepanakert and other remaining Armenian settlements were told they could stay, but it was strongly suggested that they leave. For about 2 weeks, over 150,000 Armenians fled the region, mostly on foot, carrying what belongings they could with them and essentially ending centuries of Armenian culture in Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia's traditional ally Russia has been focused on its war in Ukraine and its tremendous losses in men and equipment. In the short time since their expulsion, the Armenians have begun to buy more and more advanced weapons, mainly from France. In 2020, the Armenians found themselves outgunned by the Azeris, who made great use of armed drones 2 years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They have vowed to modernize their army rapidly, and in a mirror image of Nagorno-Karabakh, small enclaves of Azeris live within the borders of Armenia. Most political and military analysts believe this conflict is far from over. Why would it be? It's been going on for centuries. When Britain let go of its empire in South Asia in 1947, it left behind two massive states, India and Pakistan. Their borders were drawn along religious lines, but is geography really so simple as a line on a map? South Asia's Muslim-majority areas lay to the northwest of the subcontinent and in the northeast. The nations we know today as Pakistan and Bangladesh respectively. The British thought that such a division between India and Pakistan would minimize religious conflict. Instead, it drew the battle lines for divisions that would spill over into war and attempted genocide. Today, on A Day in History, we look at the genocide inflicted upon Bangladesh during its liberation war, and the suffering that surrounded the birth of a new nation whose only crime was winning an election. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. The Dominion of Pakistan came into existence in 1947. Covering the modern area of Pakistan in the west and Bangladesh in the east, their shared Muslim faith was not enough to bridge the many linguistic, ethnic, and cultural gaps between the two sides of the country. West Pakistan and its Urdu-speaking elites dominated the entire state, although the ethnically Bengali East were the majority of the population. The Bengali majority was discriminated against in education, the military, politics, and other aspects of life. This discrimination fell especially hard on the Hindu minority, but the Muslim majority was also characterized as a lesser cultural and racial group to the Western Pakistani. The Pakistani government also tried to suppress Bengali culture, arts, and literature as too Hindu-leaning. On top of this, economic exploitation of the East's resources with minimal return investment also created resentment, and left the East feeling more like a colony than an equal partner. Despite this, the Bengalis were reputed for their non-violence. Their discontent was funneled through democratic means, namely the Awami League (AL) under the leadership of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, also known as Sheikh Mujib. The AL pushed for more autonomy for East Pakistan, but try as they might, the Bengalis did not get the democratic resolution they'd hoped for. 1970 was the breaking point. Severe flooding in August and a devastating cyclone in November killed thousands in the east, but the government response was weak and incompetent. Decades of discrimination only made the government response sting more, and support for Bengali autonomy, even outright independence, surged. Things changed when Pakistan's military dictator, General Yahya Khan, allowed Pakistan's first ever democratic elections to take place in December of that year. Sheikh Mujib and the Awami League eagerly seized the opportunity to campaign and force the Pakistani government to concede to their demands for more autonomy. The Pakistani authorities had miscalculated. They believed the AL was a vocal minority. AL might win 60 or 70 seats in the east, but nowhere near enough to be a serious problem. They were wrong. When the results came in, 167 of East Pakistan's 169 seats went to the AL. They weren't just the largest party in the east, but the single largest party in Pakistan as a whole. Yahya Khan's government refused to concede. they'd favored the Pakistan People's Party of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Bhutto refused to recognize his rival's victory and famously threatened to break the legs of any official who accepted Mujib's victory. Yahya Khan, Bhutto and Mujib met in early 1971 to negotiate through the crisis, but got nowhere, and it was clear that the Pakistani authorities would not allow the AL to take up their democratic mandate. In March 1971, Yahya Khan blocked the AL from forming their new government. In response, Sheikh Mujib and the AL called for a general strike across all of East Pakistan. Farmers, railroad workers, soldiers, government officials, police, teachers, and more walked out, grinding the entire region to a halt. One final attempt to negotiate failed, and Pakistan decided that the only solution to the crisis was force. Throughout March, Yahya Khan had been secretly transferring thousands of soldiers into East Pakistan in preparation for a military solution to the crisis. Yahya delegated this task to General Tika Khan, who'd already earned the nickname of the Butcher of Balochistan for his brutal suppression of unrest in that region. Yahya Khan believed that overwhelming military force would crush the Bengali nationalists and force the rest into submission. "Kill 3 million, he said, and the rest will eat out of our hands. On the night of March 25th, Yahya launched Operation Searchlight. It was a massive coordinated strike on almost every major city in East Pakistan. Pakistani troops targeted AL party leaders, civil officials, police, intellectuals, academics, and anyone else who could act as a leadership class to the independence movement were hunted down. The most well-known attack on that night occurred at Dhaka University. The Pakistani authorities wanted to eliminate the academics and students of Bangladesh's best university to deprive the people of some of its greatest potential leaders. Pakistani troops entered the campus and went room to room, dormitory by dormitory, rounded up teachers and students, marched them into the open, and executed them. At least 10 teachers and 100 students were massacred in a single night. Some of the students were forced to dig graves for the massacre victims before being executed themselves. This was the first stage of the genocide. By decapitating the Bengali leadership, Pakistan hoped to leave the rest of the Bengalis as weak and easy prey. The next day, Sheikh Mujib issued a telegram to the public, announcing that they would meet the Pakistani attacks with equal force. East Pakistan was no more, and the nation of Bangladesh was now fighting for its freedom. He wrote, "Today, Bangladesh is a sovereign and independent country. The Bengalis are fighting the enemy with great courage for an independent Bangladesh. May Allah aid us in our fight for freedom. Joy Bangla, may Bangladesh be victorious." Sheikh Mujib was arrested shortly after and spent the rest of 1971 in prison. In his absence, the Bengalis heeded his call to fight. 5 battalions of the East Bengal Regiment mutinied, and civilians armed themselves for guerrilla warfare against their aggressors. This collective resistance became known as the Mukti Bahini. Bangladesh's limited military forces put up a spirited resistance to the Pakistani military, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Pakistani attacks were brutal. By March 28th, some estimates say up to 15,000 Bengalis had been killed, and another 15,000 were dead by early April. Without a centralized leadership, the early Bengali resistance was amateurish and uncoordinated. By the middle of May, Pakistan controlled most major towns and cities, while the Bengalis and their government in exile had been driven mostly into the countryside. From May 1971, the war took on a more guerrilla character as Bengali forces tried to reorganize and retake the cities. Between May and September, up to 100,000 young men were trained as guerrilla fighters. The Indian government also began extending limited support to counter their old rival of Pakistan. The Pakistanis tightened their hold on the urban areas, continuing mass arrests and executions for alleged rebels, and launching strategic assaults on villages to rout Bengali forces. Increasingly, the Pakistanis feared that any fighting-age men were potential rebels. When they entered a village, the young men were rounded up and massacred. This left men with a choice: wait and hope the Pakistanis would spare you, or flee. If they were to be treated like rebels, many young men decided to become them, and thousands joined the guerrillas as their only hope of survival. Some in Bangladesh joined the Pakistanis too. Many of these collaborators belonged to specific ethnic groups, such as the Biharis, which led to sharp ethnic divisions that would last well beyond the war. A typical massacre occurred at the village of Burunga. On May 26, 1971, Pakistani and Allied forces entered the village in the Sylhet district, where they gathered all of the village's men outside the school. They then separated out the Hindus from the Muslims. After extorting valuables from both groups, many of the Muslims were released, but the Hindus were tied up and executed in the schoolyard. At least 78 men were gunned down. One survivor vividly recalled the massacre. Bullets from machine guns were fired at the helpless people with their hands tied at the back. There was blood everywhere, but it did not end there. To ensure everyone was dead, they set them on fire. The mass extermination of young men is a common feature of genocides. By removing the fighting population, they were simultaneously wiping out the reproducing population and ensuring that there was no one to protect the older men, women, and children who were left behind. The scale of male-focused genocide has led some scholars to characterize this as a gendercide. However, that did not mean women didn't suffer. Without men to protect their communities, women were exposed to violence from the rampaging soldiers. Rape was a systemic and organized part of Pakistan's military operations. Women and girls were assaulted en masse, sometimes in front of their families, in every village that the military entered. Part of it was simple inhuman cruelty, but it was also psychological. The attacks were psychologically damaging to the women and to any witnesses, especially since Bengali culture prized honor and female chastity. Although we can never know for certain, it's thought that at least 200,000 women and girls, from pensioners to little children, were subjected to sexual violence by Pakistani forces in 1971. The ongoing violence shocked the world and created a staggering refugee crisis. Most of them flowed into India. India was quick to throw its support behind Bangladesh. An independent Bangladesh would be a significant blow to the strength of India's old enemy, and would end Indian fears of fighting a two-front war against Pakistan. On a more practical level, 10 million Bengali refugees, most of them Hindu, poured into India in 1971. It was an unsustainable amount, and India was desperate to resolve the crisis before the problem got worse. India began courting international support for Bangladesh and campaigning for countries to withdraw support from Pakistan. The Soviet Union was quick to join India in condemning the violence and signaling its support for Bangladesh. By contrast, China and the Islamic world were firmly behind Pakistan. The Western world was somewhat divided. Officially, the US and Pakistan were tentative allies, and the Nixon administration was working hard to cultivate good relations with China. However, popular opinion in the West was firmly pro-Bangladesh, especially as videos and news reports of Pakistani violence filled Western newspapers and TV broadcasts. The Indian government was caught in a geopolitical bind. They were concerned that a military intervention would antagonize China or the US and potentially cause a cascade that could lead to a major international war. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi conducted a whirlwind diplomatic tour to Moscow, Washington DC, London, and elsewhere to erode support for Pakistan and clear the way for Indian involvement. She managed to persuade the Nixon administration to end military aid for Pakistan in October 1971. At the same time that a Pakistani delegation to Beijing was politely but firmly told that China would not intervene to help Pakistan if India involved itself in Bangladesh. Pakistan interpreted India's actions as a sign of aggression. They launched a preemptive strike on Indian air bases on December 3rd, but the attacks failed to inflict any significant damage. India took this as an act of war and responded with strategic strikes on Pakistan's air and naval bases the next day, which devastated Pakistan's military capabilities. Within days, Indian troops moved across the border and linked up with the Bangladeshi freedom fighters for a combined campaign to kick the Pakistanis out of Bangladesh. Their combined assault was a tremendous success. In less than 2 weeks, most of Pakistan's air force was out of commission. The Indian Navy had effectively cut off naval access between Pakistan and Bangladesh, and hundreds of towns and cities were retaken by the combined Bangladeshi Indian forces. On December 8th, the Bangladeshi and Indian forces were on the outskirts of Dhaka, and by December 16th, they had retaken the capital. Victory came at a cost. When it was clear they were going to lose, the bitter Pakistani forces took their anger out on civilians. A spike of massacres occurred in the final days of the war, as Pakistan tried to cripple the soon-to-be independent country. On the 12th, 13th, and 14th of December, hundreds of intellectuals and professionals from all sorts of occupations were killed by retreating forces. It was one final attempt to deprive the new nation of any potential leaders. The liberation forces also found evidence of the horrors Pakistan had inflicted on civilians as they recaptured enemy positions. It was common to find captured women held in captivity in Pakistani military camps, where they'd been abused for months by the occupying forces, or to find mass graves of those the retreating forces hadn't had time to bury. Finally, on December 17, 1971, with Pakistan's military in tatters and Bangladeshi forces back in control of their cities, the two sides declared a ceasefire. Pakistani forces in Bangladesh laid down their arms, and the war and its genocide were over. Bangladesh was the first nation-state to earn its independence by waging a successful war of liberation against a post-colonial state. Additionally, the intervention of the Indian military was one of the only examples of a genocide being ended thanks to external intervention. Most academics accept that what happened in Bangladesh was a genocide. The mass targeting of ethnic leaders, the extermination of the Bengali male population, and the specific targeting of Hindu minorities within Bangladesh all meet the conditions for genocide. The death toll from the war and accompanying genocide has divided historians. A wide range between 300,000 and 500,000 is the usual estimate, but Bangladesh officially counts 3 million dead in 1971. 40 million people were displaced and millions more suffered injuries or sexual abuse. The long-term effects of the genocide are still being felt. Many rape victims were cast out of their families out of a belief that rape sullied the honor of the family, leaving an epidemic of women abandoned after 1971. The disproportionate death of men also had severe social and economic consequences, as essential jobs went undone and women were forced into the workforce to make up the shortfall. The normalization of violence and social trauma of the genocide also led to a sharp rise in violent crime that continues to this day. Additionally, the collaboration by some ethnic minorities with the Pakistani forces led to reprisal violence in the 1970s. As many as 150,000 people were killed by ethnically targeted mob violence in post-war Bangladesh for belonging to ethnicities who were all painted as collaborators. Official efforts to prosecute collaborators led to tens of thousands of detentions, although far fewer trials and even fewer convictions. As you might expect, accountability for Pakistan was non-existent. Despite the vast amount of video, documentary, and eyewitness evidence, Pakistan still denies wrongdoing. It blames the rogue action of soldiers for the undeniable episodes of violence, while official Pakistani estimates vastly downplay the actual number of casualties. Not a single Pakistani faced any punishment for the murder, rape, or other abuse inflicted upon millions of people. The rest of the world's sympathy faded once the massacres left the headlines. Today, the Bangladesh genocide is just one of numerous forgotten atrocities of the 20th century. Depending on the death tolls you believe, the fact that all of this occurred in just 9 months between March and December 1971 makes this one of the most intense genocides in the 20th century. But as we've seen many times on this channel, the scale and severity of crimes do nothing to guarantee their perpetrators will be punished, or that their victims will be remembered. An account of the violence that took place in the summer of 1943 in southeastern Poland. They came and smashed his head with an axe. Then they went in. His wife was sleeping in bed when they struck the woman in the head with an axe. Then her son, about 9 or 10 years old, sprang up and cried, "Stepan, don't kill me. I'll give you some bread." This means that it was a man the child knew. And that man struck the boy with an axe in the head, and the child collapsed onto the floor. The 2 eldest boys were sleeping up on the warming stove out of sight, and thus survived. The killers were Ukrainian nationalists and their victims, Poles. Welcome to a day in history. Today, the horrors of the Volhynian massacres. Among the many things that the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine did was bring 2 groups of people together who nearly 80 years before had been at each other's throats, literally. Today, Poland and Ukraine are close allies, and Poland has supplied Ukraine with billions of dollars of supplies, equipment, and weapons to help it fight off Putin's invasion. There are very few people alive who experienced the events we're going to tell you about today. But if they were, they would likely be shocked that Poland and Ukraine are so close. What's more, they would be amazed that though it took 80 years to happen, the president of Ukraine recognized that during the last half of World War II and for a time after the war was over, is today on a day in history, the massacres in Volhynia, Volyn or Volinsko. No country lost a higher percentage of its population in World War II than Poland. Nearly 1 in 5 Poles lost their lives during the war, including ethnic Poles, Polish Jews, and others. Almost 6 million Poles lost their lives during the war out of a pre-war population of 34 million. When you then consider the number of people sent to the Nazi death camps during the war, approximately 10 to 12 million people were killed in Poland from 1939 to 45. Poland is about the size of New Mexico, and it became a graveyard. Unfortunately for Poland, its geographic location has put it in the path of many other nations, kings, and empires. To the north, it's Sweden, which occupied large swaths of northern Poland for many years in the 17th and 18th centuries. To the west, it's Germany, and before 1871, the most powerful German kingdom, Prussia. To the south were the Austrian and Austro-Hungarian empires, and to the east, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which sometimes included the territory of today's Ukraine. From 1772 to 1918, Poland's territory was divided between Prussia, Germany, Austria, and Russia. When World War I ended, the Poles, aided by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, won their independence. In the southeastern region of Eastern Galicia, a large part of the population was ethnic Ukrainian. In the province just to the north, known as Volhynia in English and Volinsko in Ukrainian and Polish, before the Holocaust, about 30% of the people in Volhynia were Jews. Most of the rest were Poles, along with some Roma and a small ethnic group called the Lemko. Until World War II, most Poles and Ukrainians in Volhynia got along. So many ethnicities had lived, shared, and governed the region for so long that a sense of shared history and interdependence had developed, making the outbreak of violence all the more shocking and tragic. On September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. Just over 2 weeks later, Stalin ordered the Red Army to occupy the eastern portion of Poland. Squeezed by two of the most powerful countries on earth, the Poles were doomed. In eastern Poland, the Red Army rounded up well-known Polish nationalists, intellectuals of almost all points of view except communists, as well as teachers, doctors, bureaucrats, and captured soldiers. Anyone the Soviets believed might lead or inspire resistance to their rule. In the first few weeks of the Soviet occupation, tens of thousands of Poles were shot. In Nazi-occupied Western Poland, the same thing happened, except communists were target number one, followed closely by nationalist Polish army officers and aristocrats, and of course Polish Jews, though in 1939–40, the worst years of the Holocaust were in the future. When the Nazis broke their non-aggression pact with Stalin on June 22, 1941, they did the same thing to eastern Poland that they had done in the West, and within a very short time, the Holocaust began in earnest. One of the first regions of the Soviet Union to fall to the Germans was Western Ukraine, and there, the Nazis found a useful ally. In 1922, Ukraine became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The first half of the 20th century was as bloody and horrifying for most Ukrainians as it was for most Poles. Until 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in the face of revolution, the region was part of the Russian Empire. After his abdication, there was a power vacuum, and various groups vied for power. Ukrainian and Russian Bolsheviks fought Russian and Ukrainian white armies, supporting a return of the royal family. Communist and socialist groups struggled against one another. The Crimean Tatars and Cossacks fought for an independent Crimea and Ukraine. Throughout the country, but mainly in the western regions, nationalist Ukrainians of all stripes, from Democrats to ultranationalists, fought for an independent Ukrainian state. All of these movements were crushed or suppressed in a variety of ways when the Soviet Red Army won the Russian Civil War against the Whites in 1922. The man with the most power over Ukraine and the Ukrainians in 1922 was Joseph Stalin, Secretary of Nationalities for the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1923. It was Stalin who was ultimately responsible for the brutal crackdown on any form of nationalism in Ukraine, whether it came from the Ukrainians, Tatars, Cossacks, or other ethnic groups in the country. Throughout the country, the leading men and women of the various nationalist movements in Ukraine were killed, jailed, or sent to Siberia, where most died. Thousands of them. The Ukrainian nationalists who survived either went into hiding or bided their time. Still, throughout the 1920s and into the first 2 years of the 1930s, a variety of underground groups circulated nationalist and anti-Soviet propaganda, and, to some extent, carried out sabotage and delaying tactics against Stalin's big plan for Ukraine: the seizure of private farms and the formation of huge collectives, where farmers would be responsible for filling the somewhat arbitrary and unrealistic quotas of wheat and other crops that Ukraine grew in immense quantities. You can find information on many aspects of Stalin's horrific rule on our channel. Many factors caused the Holodomor, or the Great Ukrainian Famine, and that's a story for another video. But suffice it to say that through intentional seizure of crops, officials afraid to report accurate yields to Stalin, bad weather, and more, a famine tore through Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, killing between 3.5 and 5 million people. Attempts to alleviate the suffering in Ukraine were mostly rejected by Stalin, even once he found out the true scope of the disaster. Why? Because he and others in the Kremlin wanted to weaken the Ukrainian people and crush Ukrainian nationalism. To a large extent, he did, but the desire of many Ukrainians, especially in the western part of the country, to become independent remained. Throughout the 1930s, the spirit of Ukrainian nationalism went underground or into the country's forests, hills, and mountains, waiting for its moment. In 1926, Marshal Józef Piłsudski, one of the leading figures of the Polish government since 1918, staged a coup and put himself in power. Piłsudski believed that the Western-style democratic system put in place in Poland since 1918 was weak and was allowing Poland to be torn apart by communists, sponsored by the Soviet Union, and various nationalist movements among the ethnic groups of the country. The largest non-Polish ethnic group, aside from the Jews, was the Ukrainians. While there were sizable numbers of Ukrainians throughout much of Poland, most lived in the southwest, in and around the region of Volhynia. Before Piłsudski's nationalist coup, most Poles and Ukrainians in Volhynia lived in relative harmony. Many Ukrainians in Poland were Catholic, but those who belonged to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church were generally left to worship as they pleased. Many, if not most, people in Volhynia could speak one another's language, at least well enough to make themselves understood, and there were significant numbers of Polish-Ukrainian marriages. Most of the people in Volhynia also hated the Soviet Union and were conscious of the threat that it posed. Both groups of people had experienced Russian and Soviet rule firsthand. Unfortunately, Piłsudski and the men around him believed the Ukrainians in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia to be a threat to Poland, and began enacting laws restricting the use of Ukrainian in public, fired Ukrainian civil servants, and replaced them with ethnic Poles, and put nationalist Poles in positions of power throughout the region. From 1926 to 1939, the Ukrainians of southeastern Poland experienced increasing levels of discrimination. Worse still, Polish government propaganda, some of it subtle, some of it not, portrayed the Ukrainians of Poland as primitive and backward or plotting to either separate from Poland or move to join the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Piłsudski and his men were virulently anti-communist, and though 9 out of 10 pre-World War II Polish Ukrainians would rather have eaten glass than join the Soviet Union, the threat of communist expansion into Poland was enough to start to slowly turn neighbor against neighbor. When the Soviet Union took over eastern Poland in 1939, the Red Army and the Soviet secret police combed the countryside, crushing any ideas of autonomy for the Ukrainians of Volhynia. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on who you were, the Soviets were not able to crush a group called the OUN, or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who were hiding in the woods and forests of both Ukraine and Volhynia. The story of the formation and rise of the OUN is complicated, and best left to another time, but by the outbreak of World War II, the OUN had splintered into 2 main groups: OUN-M, led by Andriy Melnik, and OUN-B, led by Stepan Bandera. Both groups were intensely nationalistic, and both wanted an independent Ukraine. However, as time went by and both Soviet and Polish repression continued, the OUN-B became the more powerful and influential group. In Ukraine and the nations around it, mostly Russia, Stepan Bandera's legacy is problematic today. A great many Ukrainians, while condemning the violent excesses of Bandera's movement and his cooperation with the Nazis during World War II, also recognize him as one of the leaders of the pro-independence movement, something which Ukraine only achieved in 1991 and is fighting for today. A smaller group revere Bandera, but these are primarily ultra-nationalist Ukrainians who have fringe and neo-fascist beliefs. Most Ukrainians today reject Bandera as being an anti-Semite and collaborator who brought disgrace to their people through his and his followers' actions. Bandera and the OUN-B called for an independent Ukraine, which would include the region of Volhynia, where ethnic Ukrainians were the majority. Bandera was anti-Semitic in the extreme, but believed that Jews and every other ethnic group should be driven from Ukrainian territory, or what he thought should be Ukrainian territory, driven or killed. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, they saw the Ukrainian nationalists of both OUN groups as useful allies, in crushing not only the Soviet system, but also in their plans to eliminate the Jews of Ukraine. While both OUN groups advocated for a Ukraine free of foreigners, at least some of them believed that through negotiation, pressure, and the threat of violence, non-Ukrainians in Ukraine and Volhynia could be forced out of the country. However, both branches of the OUN, as well as other smaller groups and a large segment of the Ukrainian population, were virulently anti-Semitic. When the Germans began the mass killing of Jews on Ukrainian territory, the infamous Holocaust by bullets, conducted by the SS Einsatzgruppen or Special Action Groups, the OUN saw their chance to remove the Jews from Ukrainian life for good. OUN Ukrainian militiamen aided the Nazis in locating, deporting, and shooting Jews by the hundreds of thousands. In Volhynia, Ukrainians working with the Nazis took part in the killing of perhaps 200,000 Jews and developed a reputation for extreme brutality, even among the Nazis. Many historians believe that the actions of the OUN, along with the actions of the many Ukrainians who later worked as guards in extermination camps, such as Sobibor and Treblinka, exposed them to and encouraged them to take part in such unbelievable horror that they became numb to human suffering. Combined with the anti-Polish feelings that had been growing in Volhynia and Ukraine since Pilsudski's coup and the rise of violent fascism throughout Europe, by 1943, the Ukrainians of the OUNB and other groups had accepted and even embraced the idea that all non-Ukrainians in what they believed was Ukrainian territory should be eliminated. In July 1943, Hitler's massive armored attack at Kursk was defeated by an even more massive Soviet counterattack. After Kursk, it was clear to most people that Nazi Germany would eventually be defeated. Throughout the summer and into the fall of 1943, the Soviets began to push the Germans steadily backward, and were pushing into Ukraine and towards Poland. Bandera and the other radicals in the OUN believed that before the Soviets could take over and consolidate Ukraine, at least Western Ukraine once again, they needed to do two things: set up a government and proclaim an independent Ukrainian state which included Volhynia. The Nazis had already done the Ukrainians a favor by killing most of the Jews of Ukraine. And as the Nazis pushed east in 1941 to 42, Stalin had deported the Crimean Tatars to Siberia, fearing they would join the Nazis and push for their own territory like the OUN. Eastern Ukraine, as we have seen in the last 2 years during Putin's so-called special operation, is populated by both Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. Bandera and the rest of the OUN realized that if they were going to form an independent nation, it would have to be in Western Ukraine and gain Volhynia. The OUNB's military wing, the UPA, or Ukrainian Insurgent Army, began a program of what Poles called genocide. In Volhynia, large groups of dozens and sometimes hundreds of men and occasionally women began to raid Polish villages. By 1943, many of these men had seen and participated in mass killings many times. To most of them, killing became an everyday thing. Psychologists and sociologists have studied what happens to many people in these circumstances. Fueled by hatred or injustice, and given permission by their leaders and society, some people begin to enjoy killing. They make a game of it, not only killing for so-called political reasons, but for sport, exhilaration, and like many addicts, they have to do more and in more ways. Be warned now, the killings in Volhynia were brutal beyond belief. Throughout the rest of 1943 and into the summer of 1944, the OUNB and UPA, along with many Ukrainian villagers who had been riled up by OUN propaganda, as well as the actions of the pre-war Polish government, spread out through the countryside, killing Poles and any remaining Jews they could find. Though there was plenty of gun violence, one of the things that makes the killings in Volhynia different was that much of the killing was done with the tools that any rural farm would have: scythes, hammers, knives, and especially axes. In hundreds of villages throughout that year, and even for a short time after, Ukrainians went on a killing spree. Of course, not all of the Volhynian Ukrainians became murderers. Many of them have since been named the Ukrainian Righteous for helping to save Poles and Jews from death. And anyone believed to be helping Poles or Jews was at risk of a horrible death. Throughout Volhynia, Ukrainian husbands were forced to kill their Polish wives. Forced, meaning beaten or tortured within an inch of their lives, and the half-Ukrainian, half-Polish children threatened. Those who refused were killed on the spot. Many accounts tell of men being brought to the center of the village, their children or extended families being forced to watch while they were bludgeoned with hammers or beheaded with axes. In many places, the Polish Resistance Army, the AK or Armia Krajowa, sent men or weapons to Polish villages to help defend them against the OUN-UPA. But their ability to do that was limited by their struggle against the Nazis. The first people killed were the men. In many places, women and girls were raped and then killed. Many old men, women, and children were locked inside churches which were set on fire. In some places, men who had seen too much and only came alive around violence and death became almost unrecognizable as human beings. Eyes were gouged out. Living babies were torn apart. The unborn were cut from their mothers' bellies. People were set on fire. The list is almost endless. By this time, most German units in the area were rear echelon soldiers, made up of older men who were under orders to not interfere. But amazingly enough, there are a number of accounts of German soldiers helping and evacuating Polish civilians who had survived the horrors. When the Red Army retook Soviet Ukraine and Poland, they realized that things in Volhynia could spiral completely out of control. By 1945, the Polish AK had become a force to be reckoned with, and battles with Soviet troops as well as Polish militias had weakened the OUN. By the end of the war, the situation in Volhynia had turned into a cycle of revenge. It's important to know that while the majority of the killings in the region were done by the OUN-UPA, Polish militias also roamed the countryside attacking Ukrainian villages in revenge. And their brutality was not much different from that of their enemies. Feelings on this issue still run strong in Poland, and to a degree in Ukraine, so accurate estimates of the numbers killed on both sides are hard to come by. But in general, historians from outside the region believe the number of Poles killed could have been well over 100,000, and the numbers of Ukrainians nearing 15,000. What put a stop to the killing? The Red Army and the Yalta Agreements made by Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt in February 1945. At the end of the war, the borders of Poland were shifted west at the expense of Germany. The Soviets took part of eastern Poland, and Volhynia was annexed to Ukraine. Those Poles who had survived and remained in the region were either sent to Poland or to Siberia. Today, Poles make up less than 1% of the population of Ukraine. On January 23, 2023, Ukrainian President Zelensky and Polish President Andrzej Duda met in Lviv, once a Polish city, to discuss Poland's military aid to Ukraine. While there, they stopped at a church to honor the victims of what the Poles call a genocide, and many Ukrainians still call a case of ethnic cleansing. Thank you for watching. See you next time.